Now, the two-day G20 Summit has concluded in New Delhi. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi has handed over the presidency to Brazil. Leaders present at the G20 Summit in New Delhi adopted a consensus declaration as they make commitments on several issues ranging from food and energy security to climate change. Now, in the summit, which was themed as One Earth, One Family and One Future, global leaders vowed to act in concrete ways through partnerships that will result in a strong, sustainable, balanced and inclusive growth. The summit started with the inclusion of African Union as a permanent member of the grouping of world's largest economies, and by doing so, the leaders hope that the African Union will provide a wider stage to Global South within the G20. Right after this, the joint declaration was adopted, an agreement on the toned-down language while mentioning the war in Ukraine and dropping any references to criticize Russia for the war, established India's role as an efficient arbitrator. Now, India says that it used the G20 presidency to focus on the needs and aspirations of countries of the Global South. The next notable outcome of the summit is the India-Middle East-Europe Economic Corridor, touted as an alternative to China's Belt and Road Initiative. The deal aims to step up rail and ports links between West Asia and South Asia and eventually to Europe. The plan is to lay railway lines in West Asia and connecting them to India by ports. Meanwhile, on the sidelines of the summit, Italy's Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni said that there is more to Italy-China relations than the BRI, while adding that the decision to pull out of BRI is still to be taken formally. Moving on to another concern, climate change. The Delhi Declaration vows to phase down and not phase out coal-based power. The G20 leaders also agreed to triple renewable energy capacity globally by 2030. This even as countries like France said that more could have been done. The leaders' stance during the summit was closely watched before the COP28 UN Climate Summit in UAE. Meanwhile, World Bank President Ajay Banga said that the G20 Delhi Declaration will help in bringing reforms and redefine the vision of the bank.
It has got many good parts to it. Selfishly, it has a great deal to do with the multilateral banks, which is good for me because it gives me the wind in my sails for me to keep pushing for reform and getting the bank to work better. That's the way I think about it.
There's no missing out also on India's soft diplomacy visible at the G20. The visit of G20 leaders to the memorial to Mahatma Gandhi at Raj Ghat and created a family photo opportunity that had been denied earlier. The G20 also proved a platform to showcase its cultural traditions at multiple levels. Now, for more on these developments, we have been joined by our correspondent Bhairavi Singh from the summit venue. Bhairavi, welcome to the broadcast. We have been hearing that the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi is set to visit the venue. Is there any update on the front?
Right, Ananya, we're expecting the Prime Minister to be here any moment now. The security detail in place, the Delhi police has cordoned off the area, the sniffer dogs have been here, the SPG is in place, so any moment now, of course, Prime Minister Modi will be here. This will be, in a sense, the conclusion of the G20 Summit, which has been successful, not just in the eyes of the Indian government, but from statements coming in from other countries as well, including the United States, the French government, the UK government, which have all hailed the G20 presidency under the Indian government. They've said, of course, that there has been a joint communique despite the divisions between Russia and China on one side and the West on the other side, the deep divisions that we saw at the G7 as well. The Indian government, of course, held a press briefing yesterday where they declared that there was 100% consensus on all issues that were discussed at the G20, whether they were on the economic front or the geopolitical front. The 8 paras on the geopolitics were all built on consensus, and from what we're picking up, of course, from reports and sources, there are over 200 hours of meetings and several rounds of negotiations, and of course 12 different paragraphs of the draft resolution were circulated within among the G20 nations to come to that conclusion. So all in all, of course, a success as far as the joint communique is concerned, but also a success in other major developments, including that announcement of the rail link between India, the US, the Middle East, all the way up to Europe, which is going to be not just a rail link, but also a port and shipping link. Will also have undersea cable links, a power grid connecting the power grid from India all the way to the Arab world to Europe. And there'll of course be two corridors to that, one from India to the Arab world and the other from the Arab world towards Europe as well. So we're awaiting Prime Minister Modi just any moment now. My colleague Molly is also with us here at the moment. And Molly, we've been discussing how there was so much speculation whether this could really happen, the joint communique, till the last minute. But what a coup, really, by India.
The very fact that the communique happened and the manner in which the consensus was forged by India, Bhairavi, has been lauded as a success story, not just here in the host country, but across the world. We've seen the headlines that have emerged over the last 24 hours, and the very fact that countries could have overshadowed the and whether or not a communique will actually emerge or not. These were the questions that were talked about, that were speculated upon in the run-up to the G20 summit. But what a spectacular achievement it was for India to actually arrive at that consensus and to issue a statement saying that 100% consensus was achieved. Beyond that, just look at the way the country has pushed for inclusivity as far as the G20 is concerned. The first time the bloc is being expanded since its inception with the 55-member bloc, the African Union finding a place at the platform, which, by the way, also means that other multilateral platforms and forums will try and follow suit, because that's the way in which the country has set an example, a precedent for reforms in multilateral institutions. And that's something that the spokesperson for the South African president was also telling me yesterday when I spoke to him right after that announcement was made, where he mentioned that this is a standard that India has set when it comes to inclusivity in multilateral forums, which should also be replicated. So that's a very strong sentiment that's being echoed in those statements that have been issued following that announcement as well.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, the fact is that, I also spoke to some senior officials in the US government right after President Biden had, flown out of New Delhi, and they said that President Biden was extremely happy with how the G20 had been, had obviously ended at a good note, and that all countries had found some sort of common ground here, even though there were, before the event, there were several rounds where we felt like there would be no meeting point. Of course, there were also a series of press conferences right after. The French president also had a press conference where he spoke about the fact that 16 out of the 20 countries, or 19 countries rather, did have a dissent note about Russia and Ukraine, but they thought that consensus building was more important at the G20 at this particular stage in geopolitics than anything else, and therefore they went ahead. I think that's the sentiment that has been there, all along, that the economic issues are more important at this point than the Russia-Ukraine war standalone. Ananya, it's back to you in the studio.
Absolutely, Bhairavi and Mori, thanks for getting us all those updates from the ground. And as we can see behind you as well, everyone's patiently waiting for the comments that are set to come from the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, and we will be tracking that very closely.